21-year-old Mia Farrow sat on the edge of a leather sofa, a 10-page legal document on the coffee table in front of her. Her hands were shaking. Across from her, two attorneys in expensive suits watched impassively. Frank Sinatra stood by the window, looking out at the glowing Las Vegas Strip, his back to the room. He hadn't looked at Mia since the attorneys arrived 30 minutes earlier. They were supposed to get married tomorrow. A quick ceremony at the Sands, just a few close friends. Nothing elaborate. Frank was 50 years old and had been married twice before. This was going to be simple. But first, Mia had to sign the contract. "Miss Farrow," one of the attorneys said, his voice professionally neutral. "This is a standard prenuptial agreement. It protects Mr. Sinatra's assets and establishes certain expectations for the marriage." Mia looked down at the pages. Most of it was legal language she didn't fully understand. Financial protections, property rights, standard prenuptial material. But on page 7, in plain language, was a clause that made her stomach turn. The parties agree that no children shall be conceived or born during the term of this marriage. Should pregnancy occur, the marriage shall be immediately dissolved. Mia read it 3 times. No children. Not, "we'll wait." Not, "we'll discuss it later." No children, ever. If she got pregnant, the marriage was over. She looked up at Frank. He was still staring out the window, refusing to meet her eyes. "Frank?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We never talked about this." Frank turned finally, his face unreadable. "I'm 50 years old, Mia. I have 3 grown children. I'm not starting over with diapers and bottles. I thought you understood that." "But we never—" "It's in the contract," one of the attorneys interrupted. "If you want to marry Mr. Sinatra tomorrow, you sign the contract, all of it, including that clause." Mia stared at the document. 24 hours from now, she was supposed to become Mrs. Frank Sinatra. She'd already told her family. The ceremony was arranged. The press knew, and Frank was asking her to promise she'd never have his children. Mia Farrow signed the contract that night. The marriage lasted 16 months, and for 54 years, she never publicly discussed what she'd agreed to before walking down that aisle, until 2020, when she published her memoir and finally revealed the truth about the contract that had destroyed her marriage to Frank Sinatra before it even began. This is the story of that contract, what it contained, why Frank demanded it, and how a 21-year-old woman who wanted children married a 50-year-old man who refused to give her any. To understand why Frank Sinatra made Mia Farrow sign that contract, you have to understand where he was in his life in 1966. Frank had been famous for over 20 years. He'd been married twice, first to Nancy Barbato from 1939 to 1951, with whom he had 3 children, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., and Tina. That marriage ended when Frank left Nancy for Ava Gardner, the love of his life. The marriage to Ava lasted from 1951 to 1957, though the series separated much earlier. It was passionate, violent, destructive. They fought constantly. The relationship was fueled by jealousy, alcohol, and an intensity that neither of them could sustain. Ava wanted children. Frank claimed he did too. But she had 2 miscarriages during their marriage, both of which devastated her. Some biographers suggest at least one was actually an abortion, though this has never been confirmed. The question of children became one of many toxic issues in their relationship. By the time Frank and Ava divorced, Frank was 41 years old and swore he'd never marry again. He'd been through the domestic family life with Nancy. He'd been through the passionate chaos with Ava. He was done. But then he met Mia Farrow. Mia was the daughter of actress Maureen O'Sullivan and director John Farrow. She'd grown up in Hollywood, but had a wholesome, almost innocent quality that was unusual for that world. In 1964, at age 19, she'd been cast in the TV show Peyton Place and become a breakout star. She met Frank at Daryl Zanuck's studio in 1964. He was 48. She was 19. The age gap was scandalous. He was literally old enough to be her father. but they connected. Frank was charming, sophisticated, powerful. Mia was young, beautiful, fascinated by him. Their relationship developed slowly over 2 years. Frank was cautious at first, aware of how it looked, but by 1966, he'd decided he wanted to marry her. His children were horrified. Nancy Jr. was 26, 5 years older than Mia. Frank Jr. was 22, just 1 year older than Mia. Tina was 18, younger than the woman their father planned to marry. Frank's friends were skeptical too. Why was he marrying this kid? What did they have in common? How long could it possibly last? But Frank was determined. He loved Mia, or at least, he loved the version of himself he was when he was with her, younger, energized, still capable of capturing a beautiful young woman's attention. There was just one problem. Mia wanted children, and Frank absolutely did not. Mia Farrow had lived a remarkable life by 2020. After Sinatra, she'd been married to composer Andre Previn, with whom she had 3 biological children and 3 adopted children. Then she'd had a long relationship with Woody Allen, adopting more children and having 1 biological son with him. That relationship ended in scandal in 1992. By 2020, Mia was 75 years old and had 14 children, biological and adopted. She'd lived through abuse allegations, custody battles, and extraordinary public scrutiny. In March 2020, she published her memoir, What Falls Away. The book covered her entire life, but one chapter stood out: the brief marriage to Frank Sinatra and the contract she'd signed 54 years earlier. Mia's description of finding out about the contract was published in the book. She wrote about that night in Frank's suite at the Sands, seeing the document for the first time, reading the no children clause, and the impossible choice she faced. Entertainment journalist Nancy Collins, who interviewed Mia about the memoir in April 2020, later described the revelation. When Mia told me about the contract, I was shocked. This wasn't just a prenup protecting assets. This was Frank Sinatra telling a 21-year-old woman, if you want to marry me, you have to promise never to have children. I asked Mia why she signed it. She looked at me and said, I was 21. I was in love, and I thought I could change his mind. The memoir included details Mia had never shared publicly. She described the attorneys explaining the contract, Frank's refusal to discuss it or negotiate, the pressure she felt with the wedding scheduled for the next day, and the moment she picked up the pen and signed away her right to have children with the man she was marrying. In a 2020 interview with the New York Times, Mia elaborated, Frank told me he was too old to start over with children. He already had 3. He'd already done the whole parenting thing. He wanted to enjoy his life, travel, perform. A baby didn't fit into that plan. I told him I wanted children someday. He said, someday, maybe, but not while we're married, and certainly not in the next few years. I thought he meant we'd wait, maybe 5 years, maybe 10. I didn't realize he meant never, that the contract I signed legally prohibited me from having his children, ever. Mia's memoir and subsequent interviews revealed more details about the contract's contents. While the full document has never been publicly released, it remains sealed in legal archives. Mia described the key provisions, financial provisions, standard prenuptial protections. Mia would receive no claim to Frank's existing assets, properties, or earnings. If the marriage ended, she'd receive a modest settlement, $50,000, which in 1966 was significant, but not extravagant given Frank's wealth. Career provisions. Mia agreed to prioritize Frank's schedule over her own career. If there was a conflict between her acting work and Frank's plans, his took precedence. This was presented as reasonable. Frank was the bigger star, the primary earner, but it effectively gave him veto power over her career. Social provisions. Mia agreed to attend Frank's performances, travel with him when requested, and be present at social functions he deemed important. Again, presented as reasonable expectations for a spouse. But combined with the other provisions, it meant Mia's life would revolve entirely around Frank's. The children clause. the most controversial provision. Explicit language stating no children would be conceived during the marriage. If pregnancy occurred, Frank had the right to immediately file for divorce, and the financial settlement would be voided. Mia would leave the marriage with nothing. Mia described reading this clause in her memoir. I remember staring at those words. No children shall be conceived. Not, we agree to wait. Not, we'll discuss timing. Just no, ever. I looked at Frank and said, what if I want children in a few years? He said, then you'll have them with someone else. Not with me. Not during our marriage. One of the attorneys clarified, the contract is clear, Miss Farrow. If you become pregnant with Mr. Sinatra's child, the marriage is over and you receive nothing. I felt sick, but I signed anyway. The wedding took place on July 19th, 1966, at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Mia wore a simple white suit. Frank wore a dark suit and his characteristic fedora. The ceremony was brief, just a few minutes. Among the guests were a handful of Frank's friends from the Rat Pack and Mia's mother, Maureen O'Sullivan, who looked deeply unhappy throughout. Mia described the wedding in her memoir as surreal. She'd just signed a contract the night before that prohibited her from having children. She was marrying a man 30 years older than her, and despite being surrounded by people, she felt profoundly alone. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. Frank was charming, entertaining, the life of the party. Mia played the role of the happy bride, but inside, she was already questioning what she'd agreed to. That night, in their suite, Mia tried to talk to Frank about the contract, specifically about the children clause. I asked him if it was really non-negotiable, Mia wrote, if there was absolutely no possibility of children ever. Frank looked at me with that intense stare he had and said, Mia, I told you from the beginning, I'm 50 years old. I have grown children. I'm not doing midnight feedings and little league games again. That part of my life is over. I said, but what about what I want? He said, you knew what you were signing up for. You saw the contract. You signed it. And that was the end of the discussion. The marriage quickly fell into a pattern. Frank toured constantly. Mia accompanied him when he allowed it, but often he preferred she stay behind. He was controlling about what she wore, who she spent time with, what roles she accepted. Mia was filming Rosemary's Baby in 1967, the role that would make her a major film star. Frank resented the time it took. He wanted her available when he wanted her. The film's shooting schedule meant she wasn't always available, but the real tension in the marriage was always the same issue. Children. Mia wrote about conversations they had throughout 1966 and 1967. I would mention children occasionally, testing, hoping maybe he'd changed his mind. He never had. Once I said, Frank, I'm only 22. Don't you think I might want children someday? He said, not with me. We had an agreement. I said, but what if I change my mind about that agreement? He said, then you change your mind about the marriage. Those are your options. It was black and white to him. The contract was the contract. I'd agreed to it. End of discussion. By early 1968, the marriage was falling apart. Frank had grown increasingly controlling and jealous. Mia was suffocating under his demands and the realization that she'd traded away her future, specifically her chance at motherhood, for a marriage that wasn't making either of them happy. The final breaking point came in November 1968. Mia was still filming Rosemary's Baby. The production was running over schedule. Roman Polanski, the director, needed her for additional scenes. Frank demanded she leave the production and join him in Las Vegas. Mia refused. She had a contract with Paramount, professional obligations. Frank's response was cold and final. Mia described it in her memoir. Frank's attorney called me on set. He said, Mr. Sinatra wants you to know he's filed for divorce. You'll be served papers later today. I was shocked. We'd been fighting, yes, but I thought we'd work it out. Then the attorney said something that made me realize how planned this was. Per the prenuptial agreement, since you violated the terms regarding prioritization of Mr. Sinatra's she was 23 years old. Her career as a serious actress was just beginning with Rosemary's Baby, and she'd been legally married to Frank Sinatra for 16 months, during which she'd been prohibited from having children and essentially told her life should revolve around his. Edule over your career. The marriage is dissolved and you're entitled to no settlement. I said, "What are you talking about? I didn't violate anything." He said, "Mr. Sinatra requested your presence in Las Vegas. You refused. That constitutes a material breach of the marital agreement." That's when I understood. Frank didn't just want a divorce. He wanted me to get nothing. And he was using the contract I'd signed when I was 21 and naive, to make sure I left the marriage with exactly what I'd brought into it. Nothing. The divorce was finalized in August 1968, 16 months after the wedding. Mia received no settlement. The contract's provisions were enforced. She'd breached by choosing her career over Frank's demands, so she forfeited any financial claim. She was 23 years old. Her career as a serious actress was just beginning with Rosemary's Baby, and she'd been legally married to Frank Sinatra for 16 months, during which she'd been prohibited from having children and essentially told her life should revolve around his. Mia didn't speak publicly about the contract for years. When asked about the marriage in interviews during the 1970s and 80s, she'd say simply that it hadn't worked out, that they were too different, that the age gap was too significant. But privately, according to friends who spoke after Mia's 2020 memoir was published, she was devastated, not heartbroken over losing Frank. By the end, she was ready to leave, but devastated by what she'd given up. Andre Previn, who married Mia in 1970, spoke about this in a 1997 interview, though he didn't mention the contract specifically at that time. When I met Mia, she was very clear about wanting children. Immediately, she was 25 and said she'd already wasted 4 years, 2 with Frank and 2 recovering from that relationship. She wanted children desperately, like it was something that had been denied her and she was reclaiming it. Mia and Andre had 3 biological children together, twins Matthew and Sasha in 1970 and Fletcher in 1974. They also adopted 3 children during their marriage. After her relationship with Woody Allen began in 1980, Mia adopted more children. By the time she was 50, she had 14 children total, some biological, some adopted. In her 2020 memoir, Mia wrote about this explicitly. People asked why I adopted so many children, why I kept expanding my family. Part of it was genuine desire to help children who needed homes. But part of it, honestly, was reclaiming what Frank had taken from me. He'd made me sign a contract at 21 that said I couldn't have children, that if I got pregnant, I'd lose everything. So once I was free of that contract, free of that marriage, I spent the next 30 years having and adopting as many children as I could, partly because I wanted them, but also because I could. It was my way of saying, you don't control me anymore. You can't tell me what to do with my life, my future. Every child I had or adopted was a refutation of that contract. Frank Sinatra never publicly commented on the contract. When asked about his marriage to Mia in later interviews, he was dismissive. He'd say things like, "We were too different," or "She was too young," or "It was a mistake." But people close to Frank said he regretted how it ended, not the divorce itself. He'd moved on quickly to other relationships, but how he'd handled it, the contract, the control, the way he'd treated a 21-year-old woman who'd loved him. Tina Sinatra, Frank's youngest daughter, wrote about this in her 2000 memoir, My Father's Daughter. Dad felt guilty about Mia. He never said it directly, but I could tell. He'd been cruel to her in ways he didn't need to be. The contract was one example, making her sign away her right to have children. That was about control, not protection. Years later, when Mia was in the news for all her adopted children, Dad would watch the coverage and get quiet. I think he was thinking about what he'd denied her. He'd made her promise at 21. One time, in the 1980s, he saw Mia on TV with her kids. He said to me, "She would have been a good mother to my children." I said, "She tried to be, Dad." You wouldn't let her. He didn't respond, just turned off the TV and left the room. The full truth about the contract didn't emerge until Mia's 2020 memoir, published when she was 75, and Frank had been dead for 22 years. The revelation was shocking to many people who'd followed Mia's career and life. The marriage to Frank had always been portrayed as a youthful mistake, a young actress swept up by an older star, a relationship that couldn't survive the age gap and different life stages. But the contract revealed something darker. It showed a 50-year-old man who'd used his power, wealth, and legal resources to control a 21-year-old woman, who'd made her sign away her reproductive rights as a condition of marriage, who'd enforced that contract ruthlessly when she tried to assert any independence. Dr. Michelle Oberman, a law professor at Santa Clara University who specializes in reproductive rights, analyzed the contract in a 2020 article. What Frank Sinatra did was legal in 1966. Prenuptial agreements were enforceable. Spouses could agree to not have children, but legal doesn't mean ethical, and this contract was profoundly unethical. Frank was a 50-year-old man with enormous power, financial, social, cultural. Mia was a 21-year-old woman at the beginning of her career. The power imbalance alone makes the contract problematic, but the content makes it abusive. Frank didn't just protect his assets, he controlled Mia's reproductive choices. He told her, "If you want to be married to me, you can never have children. And if you get pregnant anyway, you lose everything." That's not a partnership, that's ownership. When Mia's memoir was published in 2020, reactions were divided. Some people defended Frank, saying it was his right to not want more children at 50, that Mia had signed the contract voluntarily, that she could have said no. Others saw it differently. They saw a young woman pressured into an agreement she didn't fully understand, with a wedding scheduled for the next day, facing enormous social pressure and an intimidating legal process. Nancy Collins, who interviewed Mia extensively about the memoir, wrote in 2020, "Mia told me she almost didn't sign the contract. She was sitting in Frank's suite, staring at that children clause, and she almost walked out. But then she thought, the wedding is tomorrow. Everyone knows. My family is here. The press is covering it. If I back out now, I'll be humiliated." So she signed. She was 21 years old and thought she could change his mind later. Thought love would be enough. It wasn't. Mia Farrow is now 79 years old. She has 14 children and numerous grandchildren. Her life has been complicated, marked by public scandals and private struggles, but she's built something Frank's contract said she couldn't have: a large, complex, loving family. In a 2023 interview, Mia was asked if she regretted marrying Frank Sinatra. "I regret signing that contract," she said. "I regret being so young and naive that I thought I could agree to never have children, and it wouldn't matter. But I don't regret the marriage itself. It taught me something important. Never give someone else control over your fundamental choices. Not your career, not your body, not your future." Frank wanted a wife who would orbit his life like a satellite, who would make him feel young and powerful, who wouldn't complicate his life with demands or needs or children. And I tried to be that person. For 16 months, I tried, but I couldn't, because that person wasn't me. And eventually, you have to choose between being who someone wants you to be and being who you actually are. I chose myself, and Frank let me go. Or more accurately, he kicked me out for choosing myself. But that was the best thing that could have happened, because it freed me to build the life I actually wanted, a life full of children and chaos and love, everything that contract said I couldn't have. The contract that Frank Sinatra made Mia Farrow sign in 1966 was a legal document. It was reviewed by attorneys, signed by both parties, and enforced when the marriage ended. But it was also a symbol of something larger: the way powerful men in the 1960s could control young women's lives, bodies, and futures through legal mechanisms that looked legitimate but were fundamentally coercive. Mia was not the first woman to sign a problematic prenuptial agreement. She won't be the last. But her willingness to finally reveal what she'd agreed to at 21 and how it shaped the rest of her life opened a conversation about reproductive autonomy, power imbalances in relationships, and the long-term impact of choices made under pressure. Frank Sinatra died in 1998 without ever publicly acknowledging the contract or discussing what it revealed about his need for control. His legacy remains complex, a legendary entertainer who was also, in his personal life, often cruel and controlling. The contract itself remains sealed in legal archives, but Mia's memoir and interviews have revealed enough to understand what it contained and what it cost her. 54 years after signing that document in a Las Vegas hotel room, Mia Farrow finally told the truth. She'd been 21 years old and in love. She'd wanted to marry Frank Sinatra, and to do that, she'd promised never to have his children. It was a promise that ended their marriage, but it also freed her to build a life that was entirely her own, full of the children Frank's contract had prohibited. The irony is perfect. Frank tried to control Mia's reproductive future through a legal contract, and Mia responded by having and adopting 14 children, building the large, chaotic family that Frank had explicitly forbidden. She signed the contract. She lost the marriage, but she won her life back, and perhaps, in the end, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribing to the channel is all it takes.